I stood in the doorway of that old barn, my hands trembling as I stared at what my grandmother had hidden inside for over 2 decades. The wooden crates were stacked floor to ceiling, each one marked with dates going back to 1987, the year I was born, the year she gave me up. Inside those crates were thousands of letters, photographs, birthday cards, Christmas presents, and school supplies, all addressed to Joshua Clark, all meant for me, seeing all the love I thought I'd never had, carefully preserved in the darkness of this forgotten barn. 24 hours earlier, I'd been packing my single duffel bag at Riverside Children's Home, preparing to age out of the system with nowhere to go and no one who cared. Now I understood that someone had been carrying it all along, even when I couldn't see it. My grandmother, Frances Castillo, had been watching, waiting, and preparing for this moment when I'd finally come home. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about what I found in that barn. It's about how an 18-year-old kid who'd never belonged anywhere finally discovered where he came from, and more importantly, where he was meant to be. I'd spent my entire life at Riverside Children's Home in Chicago, 18 years of shared bedrooms, cafeteria meals, and the constant reminder that nobody wanted me enough to make me permanent. The other kids came and went, some finding families, others like me, just waiting until they turned 18 and got shown the door with a handshake and a good luck wish. Mrs. Sharon Lewis, my caseworker, had been trying to prepare me for independent living for months. Job applications, apartment hunting, budgeting classes, all the practical stuff that was supposed to help me survive on my own. But nothing could prepare me for the loneliness of knowing that when I walked out those doors, there wouldn't be anyone checking on me, worrying about me, or missing me if I disappeared. That Tuesday morning in March, I was sitting in the common room filling out another job application when Mrs. Lewis called me into her office. She had that look on her face, the one that usually meant bad news or another disappointment. I'd seen it enough times to recognize it immediately. "Joshua, I need you to sit down," she said, gesturing to the familiar chair across from her desk. "I received a call yesterday from a lawyer in Nebraska, a man named Carl Torres." Nebraska. I'd never been outside Illinois. Couldn't even imagine what Nebraska looked like. Flat farmland probably, like in the movies. "Apparently your grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago. Frances Castillo. She owned a farm outside a town called Cedar Ridge, and according to her will, she's left everything to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Grandmother. I had a grandmother. Had, past tense. She was dead, and I'd never even known she existed. "I don't understand," I managed to say. "I don't have any family. That's why I'm here." Mrs. Lewis pulled out a file I'd never seen before, thick with papers that looked official and important. "Your mother's name was Maria Castillo. She was 17 when you were born, and according to these records, she died in a car accident when you were 6 months old. Your father was never identified. Your grandmother, Frances, was the one who brought you here." The room started spinning. 18 years of believing I'd been abandoned by parents who didn't care, and now I was learning that my grandmother, my own flesh and blood, had given me up voluntarily. "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Why would she give me away if she cared enough to leave me a farm? Mrs. Lewis's expression softened in a way I rarely saw. "I don't know, Joshua, but Mr. Torres said there are letters, lots of them. Maybe you'll find your answers there. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets even more incredible, and I want to know if you've ever discovered something about your family that completely changed everything you thought you knew." The next week passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and preparations. Carl Torres, the lawyer, was patient with my endless questions. The farm was 160 acres of corn and soybean fields, with a 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, and several outbuildings. It had been sitting empty since my grandmother's death, but it was mine now, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens, just mine. I'd never owned anything more valuable than a bicycle. Now I owned land, a house, a future I'd never imagined possible. The bus ride to Nebraska took 12 hours. 12 hours of watching the city fade into suburbs, then into farmland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I'd brought everything I owned in that single duffel bag, plus a folder containing all the legal documents that proved I was now a landowner. Carl Torres met me at the bus station in Cedar Ridge. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. The kind of man who looked like he'd never broken a promise in his life. "Joshua, I'm sorry for your loss," he said as we walked to his truck. "Your grandmother was a good woman, kept to herself mostly, but she was respected in this community." Cedar Ridge was smaller than I'd expected. Main Street had maybe 20 businesses, most of them looking like they'd been there since the 1950s. A diner, a hardware store, a bank, a post office, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger stood out immediately. "She never married?" I asked as we drove through town. "No, she raised your mother alone, worked as a seamstress, took in alterations and mending. When your mother died, Frances just seemed to fold in on herself. She kept working the farm, kept to her routines, but she rarely came to town except for necessities." We turned onto a gravel road that wound between cornfields just starting to show green shoots in the spring soil. After about 3 miles, Carl slowed and pointed ahead. "There she is." The farmhouse was white with green shutters, 2 stories with a wraparound porch that looked like it had been built for summer evenings and family gatherings. It needed paint and some repair work, but it was solid, permanent, real. Behind it stood the barn, red paint faded to rust in places, and beyond that, fields that stretched to the tree line. It was beautiful in a way I'd never experienced before. Not beautiful like a painting or a photograph, but beautiful like home was supposed to feel. Carl handed me the keys, heavy old-fashioned keys that felt significant in my palm. "Take your time looking around. I'll be back tomorrow morning to go over the legal details and help you get utilities turned on." I stood on that porch for a long time after his truck disappeared down the gravel road, just listening to the silence. No traffic, no sirens, no sounds of hundreds of people living on top of each other. Just wind in the trees and the distant sound of a tractor working a field somewhere beyond the horizon. The front door opened with a creak that sounded like a sigh. Inside, the house was clean but felt frozen in time. Floral wallpaper, furniture from the 1980s, family photographs on every surface. Photographs that included a young woman who had to be my mother and a baby that had to be me. I picked up a framed picture from the mantelpiece. My mother holding me, both of us smiling at the camera. She looked so young, barely older than I was now. Behind us, I could see part of this same living room, which meant this picture had been taken right here, in this house that was now mine. There were more pictures throughout the house. My mother as a child, playing in the yard I just walked through. My mother as a teenager, working in a garden that I could see through the kitchen window, now overgrown with weeds. My mother holding me in what looked like a hospital room, her face exhausted but radiant with new mother love. But there were no pictures of me past the age of 6 months. It was like I'd vanished from the family record the day she brought me to Riverside Children's Home. The kitchen was exactly what you'd expect in a farmhouse. Large wooden table, cast iron stove, cabinets painted yellow with age. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were newspaper clippings, local high school honor rolls, scholarship announcements, graduation ceremonies. It took me several minutes to realize what I was looking at. They were all about me. Every academic achievement, every award, every mention of Joshua Clark in the Riverside Children's Home newsletter or the local Chicago papers. She'd been following my life from hundreds of miles away, collecting proof of my accomplishments like any proud grandmother would. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, overwhelmed by the implications. She'd known about my grades, my debate team victories, my acceptance to community college that I'd had to turn down because I couldn't afford it. She'd been proud of me, proud enough to save newspaper clippings like I was the most important person in her world. So why had she never contacted me? Why had she never let me know that someone cared? The upstairs had 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom where my grandmother had slept, my mother's room which had been preserved exactly as she'd left it, and a third room that stopped me cold. It was decorated as a nursery, not an 18-year-old's room, but a baby's room. Blue walls with painted clouds, a crib that looked handmade, shelves full of toys and books appropriate for a toddler. On the dresser sat a framed birth certificate, Joshua Clark Castallo, Born March 15th, 1987. Mother, Maria Elena Castillo. Father, unknown. This had been my room, the room she'd prepared for me, the room where she'd planned for me to grow up, the room that had sat empty and waiting for 18 years. I spent that first night in my mother's room, sleeping in her childhood bed, surrounded by her books and belongings. It felt like the closest I could get to her, like maybe some part of her was still there, welcoming me home. The next morning, Carl Torres returned with a woman named Hannah Hughes who ran the local bank. They helped me set up accounts, transfer the property into my name officially, and get the utilities switched on. Hannah was probably in her 50s, with the kind of practical kindness that suggested she'd helped a lot of people through difficult transitions. Your grandmother was a customer of ours for over 30 years, she told me as we sat at her desk. Always paid her bills on time, never asked for anything she couldn't afford. She was a good woman, Joshua, quiet, but good. Did she ever mention me? I had to ask. Hannah exchanged a look with Carl. She did. Not often, but when she did, it was clear you were always on her mind. She used to come in every few months to make deposits into an account she'd set up. Said it was for her grandson's education. Another shock. There's money? Quite a bit, actually. She's been saving for your college fund since 1987. It's enough for 4 years at the state university, plus living expenses. I stared at them both, trying to process this latest revelation. Not only had my grandmother left me a farm, but she'd been planning for my education my entire life, planning for a future she'd never been part of, preparing for opportunities she'd never see me take advantage of. I still don't understand why she never contacted me, I said finally. Carl pulled out a sealed envelope from his briefcase. She left this for you with them. Maybe it will help explain. The envelope was addressed to Joshua in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same careful script. My dearest Joshua, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are finally home where you belong. I know you must have questions, and I pray that someday you will understand the choices I made, even if you cannot forgive them. When your mother died, I was consumed by grief and guilt. I blamed myself for not protecting her better, for not seeing how reckless she had become. You were so small, so perfect, and I was terrified that I would fail you the way I felt I had failed her. I was also poor, Joshua, poorer than you can imagine. The farm was failing, I had no steady income, and I was 60 years old with no idea how to raise a baby alone. I told myself that giving you to people who could provide for you properly was the most loving thing I could do. But every day since then, I have regretted that decision. Every day, I have wondered what kind of man you were becoming, whether you were happy, whether you felt loved. I followed your achievements from afar, saved every mention of your name, and felt so proud of the young man you were becoming, despite my failures as your grandmother. I never contacted you because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had given you away, ashamed that I had been too weak to fight for you, ashamed that by the time I realized my mistake, too many years had passed for me to undo it. The farm is yours now, as it should have been all along. But more than that, you have a history here, a family legacy that belongs to you. Your great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. Your grandfather planted the first corn in these fields. Your mother took her first steps on the front porch and learned to drive on these gravel roads. You are not alone, Joshua. You never were. You come from people who worked hard, loved deeply, and built something lasting. That something is yours now, to keep or change as you see fit. I hope you can forgive an old woman's mistakes and find some peace in the place where you were always meant to belong. All my love, Grandmother Frances. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak again. When I finally looked up, both Carl and Hannah were watching me with expressions of sympathy and understanding. She loved you, Hannah said quietly. In her own complicated way, she loved you very much. That afternoon, after Carl and Hannah left, I walked the property alone. The fields were recently planted, which Carl explained had been handled by a neighboring farmer named Nicholas Nelson, who'd been leasing the land since my grandmother became too frail to work it herself. The barn was massive, probably built in the 1940s, with a hayloft and stalls that hadn't housed animals in decades. It was there in the back corner behind stacks of old equipment that I found the wooden crates. At first, I thought they contained farming supplies or old household goods. But when I pried open the first crate, I discovered it was full of letters. Hundreds of them, all addressed to me at different ages. Letters for my first birthday, my first day of school, my graduation from 8th grade, my 18th birthday. Letters my grandmother had written but never sent. The second crate contained presents, wrapped gifts with tags that read, "For Joshua's 5th birthday," or "Joshua's Christmas, age 12." Toys for a little boy, books for a teenager, practical gifts for a young man. 18 years of birthdays and holidays, celebrated in secret by a woman who loved me from a distance. The third crate held photographs, pictures of me that I'd never seen before, taken from far away at school events, graduation ceremonies, debate competitions. She'd been there watching from the back of auditoriums and the edges of crowds, documenting my life like any proud family member would. But it was the fourth crate that broke me completely. It contained letters I had written, letters to Santa Claus asking for a family for Christmas, letters to God asking why I didn't have parents like the other kids, letters to my unknown mother and father, telling them about my life and asking them to come find me. Letters I'd thrown away in frustration and disappointment, never knowing that somehow my grandmother had retrieved them. Letters that proved she'd been watching closer than I'd ever imagined, caring more than I'd ever dared to hope. I sat on the barn floor surrounded by 18 years of hidden love and cried like I hadn't cried since I was a little boy. All those years of feeling unwanted, unloved, forgotten, and she'd been there the whole time. Not close enough to hold me when I was scared or celebrate my victories in person, but there nonetheless, loving me in the only way she knew how. The next few days passed in a haze of discovery and decision-making. Nicholas Nelson, the neighbor who'd been farming my land, came by to introduce himself. He was a man in his 40s with calloused hands and a direct way of speaking that I immediately trusted. "Your grandmother was a good neighbor," he told me as we walked the fence line between his property and mine. "Kept to herself, but she was fair in our dealings. I've been paying her lease on this land for 5 years now. If you want to continue that arrangement, I'd be happy to keep farming it for you." "What if I wanted to learn to farm it myself?" I asked. Nicholas stopped walking and studied me carefully. "You ever worked land before?" "No, but I'm not afraid of hard work." He nodded slowly. "Farming's more than hard work, son. It's knowledge passed down through generations, timing that comes from years of experience, and a feel for the land that you can't learn from books. But if you're serious about it, I could teach you. Start you off slow, let you work alongside me for a season or two." The offer was more generous than I'd expected from a virtual stranger. "Why would you do that?" "Because your grandmother asked me to if you ever showed up. She said if her grandson ever came home, I should help him learn the family business." That evening, I sat on the front porch reading more of my grandmother's unsent letters. In one written when I was 10, she described watching me play baseball from the parking lot of my school, too afraid to get closer but too proud to stay away. In another written when I was 15, she talked about seeing my picture in the paper after I won a debate tournament, and how she'd carried that clipping in her purse for months. The letters painted a picture of a woman tortured by her own choices but unable to find a way to undo them. As the years passed, her shame seemed to grow rather than diminish, until the very love that made her want to contact me also convinced her that she had no right to disrupt the life she'd given me. A week after my arrival, Hannah Hughes invited me to dinner at her house in town. Her husband, George Ward, was a retired teacher who'd grown up on a farm himself, and their daughter, Michelle Green, was about my age and worked as a nurse at the county hospital. It was my first real social interaction since arriving in Cedar Ridge, and I was nervous about how the community would receive me. Would they see me as an outsider trying to claim something that wasn't rightfully mine? Would they resent the city kid who'd inherited what their own children couldn't afford to buy? But the Hughes family welcomed me with a warmth that reminded me why small towns have a reputation for taking care of their own. Over dinner, they shared stories about my grandmother, my mother, and the history of my family's farm. "Your great-grandfather, Eduardo Castillo, was one of the first Mexican immigrants to settle in this area, George told me. This was back in the 1920s, when there wasn't much tolerance for outsiders. But Eduardo was a hard worker and an honest man, and eventually he earned the respect of his neighbors. Your mother was a sweet girl, Hannah added. Maybe a little wild, but sweet. She was smart like you, got good grades, but she was also restless. Always talking about seeing the world, going to college in a big city. What happened to her? I asked. I mean, I know she died in a car accident, but Hannah and George exchanged glances. She was coming back from Omaha, George said gently. She'd been there for a few days, and she was driving home late at night. The roads were icy, and she lost control of the car. Was she alone? No, Hannah said quietly. You were with her. You were in a car seat in the back. The paramedics said it was a miracle you weren't hurt. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I hadn't just lost my mother in that accident. I'd been there, a 6-month-old baby who'd survived when she didn't. No wonder my grandmother had been consumed by guilt and fear. She'd already lost her daughter and nearly lost me in the same moment. After dinner, Michelle offered to show me around town. Cedar Ridge at night was peaceful in a way I'd never experienced. Streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks. Porch lights glowed in windows of houses where families were settling in for the evening, and the only sounds were crickets and the distant hum of air conditioners. It must be strange, Michelle said as we walked past the high school where my mother had graduated, learning about all this family history you never knew existed. Strange doesn't begin to cover it, I admitted. A month ago, I thought I was completely alone in the world. Now I find out I have this whole legacy, this place where I belong. Do you think you'll stay? It was a question I'd been asking myself since the day I arrived. I don't know. I've never lived anywhere but the city. I don't know anything about farming or small-town life. But you're learning, Michelle pointed out, and you've got people willing to teach you. We stopped in front of the cemetery at the edge of town. Your mother and grandmother are buried here, Michelle said gently. Would you like to see? The cemetery was small and well-maintained, with headstones dating back to the 1800s. Michelle led me to a section near the back where 2 graves sat side by side under an old oak tree. Maria Elena Castillo, 1969 to 1987. Beloved daughter, Frances Castillo, 1927 to 2005. Beloved mother and grandmother. I stood there for a long time staring at those words. Beloved grandmother. She'd had that carved into her headstone even though she'd never been a grandmother to me in any traditional sense. Even though she'd given me away and never contacted me, she'd claimed that relationship publicly, permanently. I brought flowers, Michelle said, pulling a small bouquet from her purse. I hope you don't mind. I've been bringing them flowers since your grandmother died. It seemed like someone should. I watched her place the flowers between the 2 graves, and something loosened in my chest. This stranger, this young woman I just met, had been caring for my family's graves out of simple human kindness. In a city, my mother and grandmother might have been forgotten, their graves untended and anonymous. But here, in this small community, someone had remembered them. The next morning, I started working with Nicholas Nelson. He picked me up at dawn and spent the day teaching me about soil conditions, crop rotation, and the dozens of decisions that go into successful farming. It was harder physical work than I'd ever done, but there was something satisfying about it that surprised me. Your great-grandfather planted these fence rows, Nicholas told me as we repaired a section of damaged fencing. Your grandfather added the drainage system in the lower field. Your grandmother maintained it all by herself for 15 years after your grandfather died. Every part of the farm had history, stories that connected me to people I'd never known, but whose blood I carried. Working the land they'd worked, walking the fields they'd planted, felt like a conversation with the past. That evening, I found another crate in the barn, this one containing my grandmother's journals. Years of daily entries, most of them mundane records of weather and farm work, but scattered throughout were entries about me. March 15th, 1995, Joshua's 8th birthday today. I drove past his school hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Saw him playing on the playground during recess. He's gotten so tall. I wanted to buy him a present, but what's the point? I have no right to celebrate his birthday. June 12th, 1998. Joshua graduated from 5th grade. His picture was in the paper. He's on the honor roll again. I'm so proud of him, but I have no one to share that pride with. Sometimes I think about calling the children's home, asking about him, but what would I say? I'm the grandmother who abandoned him? September 3rd, 2001. Joshua started high school today. I remember when Maria started high school. She was so excited, so full of plans and dreams. I hope Joshua has dreams too. I hope someone is encouraging him to pursue them. Reading her private thoughts was like getting to know her for the first time. The woman in these journals wasn't the cold, uncaring person I'd imagined. She was someone wrestling with impossible choices, living with regret, loving me in the only way she felt she had the right to. As the weeks passed, I settled into a routine. Days working with Nicholas, evenings exploring the house and barn, nights reading my grandmother's letters and journals. Slowly, I began to understand not just what had happened, but why. My grandmother had been a product of her generation and circumstances. A woman who'd lost her husband young, raised a daughter alone during difficult economic times, and then watched that daughter die in a tragic accident. Her decision to give me up hadn't been made from lack of love, but from a combination of practical limitations and overwhelming grief. The shame she'd felt about that decision had grown over the years, fed by my obvious success in the foster system and her belief that I was better off without her. By the time she might have reached out, she'd convinced herself that contacting me would be selfish, that I had a life she had no right to disrupt, but she'd never stop loving me. The evidence was everywhere in that house, in those letters, in the college fund she'd built penny by penny. She'd loved me the only way she knew how, from a distance in secret preparing for a reunion she'd never be brave enough to initiate. One evening in late April, I was sitting on the front porch reading when a truck pulled into the driveway. An older man got out, someone I hadn't met before. He was probably in his 70s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. "You must be Joshua," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Eugene Gomez. I live about 2 miles down the road." We shook hands, and he settled into the other porch chair without invitation. "I knew your great-grandfather," he said. "Eduardo and I were about the same age when our families came to this area. We worked together, helped each other get established." "What was he like?" I asked. Eugene smiled. "Stubborn as hell, but fair. He had this dream of building something permanent, something that would last for his children and grandchildren. He used to say that land was the only thing they couldn't take away from you as long as you were willing to work for it." "Did you know my mother?" "I watched her grow up. She was a bright girl full of life, maybe too full of life for a place like this. She always seemed like she was looking toward the horizon, like she was waiting for something bigger to come along." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the fields. Finally, Eugene spoke again. "Your grandmother came to see me after she brought you to Chicago. She was torn up about it, questioning whether she'd done the right thing. I told her then what I'll tell you now: there's no such thing as perfect choices. There are just choices, and you live with the consequences as best you can." "Do you think she made the right choice?" Eugene considered this carefully. "I think she made the choice she could live with at the time. Whether it was right or wrong, I can't say. But I can tell you this: she never stopped regretting it, and she never stopped hoping you'd come home someday." That night, I wrote my first letter to my grandmother. Not to mail, obviously, but because I needed to say the things I would have said if I'd had the chance. "Dear Grandmother Frances," I wrote, "I understand now why you made the choices you did. I don't know if I can forgive them yet, but I understand them. You were doing what you thought was best for me, even when it broke your heart. I wish you had been brave enough to contact me. I wish you had trusted that I would have understood, that I would have been grateful just to know that someone cared. But I also understand why you couldn't. Shame is a powerful thing, and love can make us afraid in ways that nothing else can. I'm going to stay here, at least for a while. I'm going to learn to farm this land that you and our family worked for generations. I'm going to try to build the life you dreamed I might have here. Not because I owe it to you, but because it feels right. Because for the first time in my life, I'm somewhere that feels like home. I love you, even though I never got to know you. I love you for saving all those letters, for following my life from far away, for caring even when you couldn't show it. I love you for giving me this place, this history, this chance to be part of something bigger than myself. Your grandson, Joshua. By May, I had decided to enroll in the agricultural program at the community college in the county seat. It was a compromise between my need to learn practical farming skills and my grandmother's dream of me getting an education. The college fund she'd built would cover tuition easily, with plenty left over for living expenses. Nicholas was supportive of the decision. Book learning and practical experience together, that's the best way, he said. I can teach you what works on this particular land, but you'll need to understand the science behind it if you want to be successful long term. Hannah Hughes helped me with the enrollment process, and I was surprised to discover that my academic record from high school had transferred without any problems. Despite growing up in the foster system, I'd managed to maintain good grades and test scores that qualified me for several scholarships. Your grandmother would be proud, Hannah said as we reviewed my acceptance letter. She always believed education was the key to a better life. Spring turned to summer, and I fell into the rhythm of farm life. Early mornings checking crops, afternoons learning equipment maintenance, evenings studying soil science and agricultural economics. It was a different kind of education than I'd ever imagined for myself, but it felt right in a way that surprised me. The community began to accept me as more than just Francis Castillo's long-lost grandson. I was becoming Joshua Clark, the young man learning to farm the old Castillo place. People nodded to me at the hardware store, included me in conversations at the diner, asked my opinion on things I was still learning about. One evening in June, Michelle Green stopped by while I was working in the garden behind the house. I'd been trying to restore my mother's old vegetable garden using techniques I was learning in my horticulture class. Looks good, she said, examining the neat rows of tomatoes and beans. Your mom would be impressed. Did you know her well? I asked. Not really, I was just a kid when she died, but my mom talks about her sometimes. She said Maria had this way of making everything seem more exciting, more possible. We worked together in the garden as the evening cooled, and I found myself talking about things I'd never shared with anyone. The loneliness of growing up without family, the fear of never belonging anywhere, the strange mix of gratitude and resentment I felt toward my grandmother. It's okay to have complicated feelings about it, Michelle said. Love isn't always simple or clean. Sometimes the people who care about us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not because they want to, but because they don't know how to do better. That summer, I also met Karen Robinson, the retired librarian who had been my grandmother's closest friend. She came by one afternoon with a box of books that had belonged to my grandmother. Frances loved to read, Karen explained, especially books about history and biography. She said she liked reading about people who overcame difficult circumstances. Among the books was a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath, with notes in the margins written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Her notes revealed someone who understood struggle, who identified with families forced to leave everything behind in search of a better life. She used to say that your great-grandfather was like the Jodes in reverse, Karen told me. Instead of leaving the land because it failed them, he came to new land and made it work through sheer determination. Karen also brought photographs I hadn't seen before. Pictures of my grandmother as a young woman, working in the garden, hanging laundry on the line, holding my mother as a baby. In these pictures, she looked happy, hopeful, unaware of the losses that would define her later years. She was different after Maria died, Karen said. More cautious, more afraid. She'd been such a social person before, but after the accident, she just withdrew. I think giving you up was part of that withdrawal, part of her trying to protect herself from any more loss. As summer progressed, I began to feel truly settled for the first time in my life. The work was hard but satisfying, the community was welcoming, and I was building something that felt permanent and meaningful. I'd even started dating Michelle, though we were taking things slow, both of us aware that I was still figuring out who I was in this new context. One evening in July, I was cleaning out another section of the barn when I found something that changed everything I thought I understood about my grandmother's decision to give me up. Hidden behind an old workbench was a small wooden box containing legal documents. Not the property deeds and wills I'd already seen, but older papers that told a different story about my family's history. There were immigration documents from my great-grandfather showing that he'd entered the country legally, but had struggled for years to gain full citizenship. There were tax records showing how close the family had come to losing the farm during the Great Depression. There were medical bills from my grandfather's final illness that had nearly bankrupted my grandmother. But most importantly, there were letters from the state social services department dated just after my mother's death. Letters that made it clear my grandmother hadn't simply chosen to give me up. She'd been investigated, evaluated, and ultimately told that as a 60-year-old widow with limited income and no support system, she was not considered a suitable guardian for an infant. The social worker's report was devastating in its clinical assessment. Subject shows signs of severe depression following daughter's death. Financial resources inadequate for childcare. No family support system in place. Recommend immediate placement in state custody for child's welfare. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me. She'd fought for me and lost. The discovery of those documents changed everything I thought I knew about my story. My grandmother hadn't been a coward who gave me up because she was afraid or ashamed. She'd been a grieving woman who'd lost her daughter and then been told by the state that she wasn't good enough to raise her grandchild. I sat in that barn for hours, reading and rereading the social worker's reports, trying to imagine what it must have felt like to lose her daughter and then be told she wasn't fit to care for me. The shame she'd carried all these years wasn't just about her decision. It was about being judged and found wanting by people who were supposed to help families stay together. That night, I called Mrs. Sharon Lewis at Riverside Children's Home. It was late, but I needed to talk to someone who understood the system that had shaped both my life and my grandmother's. "Joshua," she said, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. "How are you settling in?" I told her about everything I'd discovered, about the legal documents and the social worker's reports. There was a long silence when I finished. "I'm sorry, Joshua," she said finally. I wish I could say that was unusual, but it wasn't. In the 1980s, the system was much less focused on keeping families together. Single older guardians, especially those dealing with grief and financial stress, were often seen as unsuitable, regardless of their love for the child. Could she have fought it? Could she have appealed? Probably not successfully, and the process would have been expensive and traumatic. Most people in her situation felt they had no choice but to comply. After I hung up, I went back to my grandmother's journals and read them with new understanding. The entries I'd interpreted as guilt and shame now read as grief and powerlessness. She hadn't been torturing herself about a choice she'd made freely. She'd been mourning a choice that had been made for her. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery and stood at her grave for a long time. I wanted to tell her that I understood now, that I didn't blame her, that I was grateful for everything she'd tried to do for me. Instead, I just stood there and let myself feel the full weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. When I got back to the farm, Nicholas was waiting for me with a proposition. His oldest son had decided not to return to farming after college, and Nicholas was looking for a long-term partner rather than just seasonal help. "I've been watching you work," he said. "You've got good instincts and you're not afraid to learn. If you're serious about making this your life, I'd like to talk about a partnership arrangement. You bring the land, I bring the experience, and we split the profits." It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. A chance to farm my family's land with someone who could teach me everything I needed to know, while still maintaining ownership of the property that connected me to my history. We spent the afternoon walking the fields and talking about possibilities: crop diversification, sustainable farming practices, maybe even agritourism if the market supported it. For the first time, I could see a clear path forward, a way to honor my family's legacy while building something new. That evening, I started writing in a journal of my own. Not letters to my grandmother, but a record of my own journey, my own discoveries, my own plans for the future. July. Teen. Today, Nicholas offered me a partnership. I said yes. I think Grandmother Frances would be proud that I'm not just keeping the farm, but working to make it successful again. I'm starting to understand that this was always her plan, not just to give me property, but to give me a purpose, a place where I could build the life she'd always dreamed I might have. As summer turned to fall, I settled into my new role as both student and farmer. The college classes gave me theoretical knowledge. while the daily work with Nicholas taught me practical skills. I was learning to read weather patterns, to understand soil conditions, to make the hundreds of small decisions that determine whether a crop succeeds or fails. The community continued to embrace me as one of their own. I joined the local volunteer fire department, helped with the harvest festival, even played on the church softball team despite having no particular religious convictions. It wasn't about faith as much as it was about belonging, about being part of something bigger than myself. Michelle and I grew closer as the months passed. She understood my complicated relationship with my family history because she'd grown up in the same community, knew the same stories, understood the weight of legacy and expectation that came with being part of a farming family. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "No," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "This is where I'm supposed to be. I can feel it in a way I've never felt anything before." In October, I received a letter from my former caseworker telling me that Riverside Children's Home was closing. Budget cuts and changing policies meant that the facility where I'd spent my entire childhood would be shuttered, the remaining children transferred to other placements. The news should have made me sad, but instead I felt a strange sense of completion. That chapter of my life was officially over, not just for me, but for everyone. I was no longer Joshua Clark from Riverside Children's Home. I was Joshua Clark from the Castillo farm in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska. For Thanksgiving, Hannah and George Hughes invited me to join their family dinner. It was the first real family holiday I'd ever experienced, complete with too much food, multiple generations around one table, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from people who've known each other their entire lives. After dinner, George pulled me aside for a conversation that had been building all year. "You've done well here, son," he said. "Your grandmother would be proud of the man you've become." "I had good teachers," I replied. "Maybe, but you had to be willing to learn. Not everyone who gets a second chance makes the most of it." That winter, I spent long evenings reading through the rest of my grandmother's papers and journals. I found records of her correspondence with my teachers at Riverside, letters asking about my progress and expressing pride in my achievements. I found copies of letters she'd written to the Social Services Department, asking for updates on my welfare and offering to pay for anything I might need. Most touching of all, I found a letter she'd written but never sent to me on my 18th birthday. "My dear Joshua," it began, "today you become a man, and I wish I could be there to see the person you've become. I know from the reports I receive that you are intelligent, kind, and hardworking. I know that you have overcome obstacles that would have defeated many people, and I am so proud of your strength and determination. I hope that someday you will find your way to this farm, to this place where your roots run deep even though you have never seen the soil. I hope that you will understand that everything I did because I loved you, even when that love wasn't enough to keep us together. You are a Castillo, Joshua. You come from people who knew how to work, how to persevere, how to build something lasting. That strength is in your blood, and I pray that it will serve you well, whatever path your life takes. Happy birthday, my dear grandson. May you find the love and belonging that I was never able to give you. All my love always." Grandmother Frances Spring came early that year, and with it, my first full season as Nicholas's partner. We'd spent the winter planning crop rotations, researching new techniques, and preparing equipment. I'd also spent time learning about the business side of farming, understanding markets, contracts, and the dozens of decisions that could mean the difference between profit and loss. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done, but it felt right in a way that nothing else in my life ever had. Getting up before dawn to check irrigation systems, spending long days in the fields during planting season, falling into bed exhausted but satisfied each night. This was the life my great-grandfather had built, the legacy my grandmother had preserved for me. In May, I graduated from the community college with an associate degree in agricultural science. It wasn't the 4-year university education my grandmother had saved for, but it was exactly what I needed for the life I was building. Hannah and George Hughes came to the graduation ceremony, along with Nicholas and his family, Michelle, and several other members of the community who had become important to me over the past year. Sitting in that auditorium, wearing my cap and gown, I thought about all the graduations my grandmother had watched from a distance, all the achievements she'd celebrated alone, all the pride she'd had no one to share with. I wish she could have been there to see this moment, to know that her investment in my education had paid off, even if not in the way she'd originally imagined. That summer, Michelle and I got engaged. It wasn't a dramatic proposal, just a quiet conversation on the front porch one evening about the future we wanted to build together. She'd been accepted to a nursing program in Omaha, but she was willing to commute rather than leave Cedar Ridge. We both understood that we were choosing not just each other, but the life we wanted to create in this place that had become home to both of us. As we planned our wedding for the following spring, I found myself thinking about my mother and grandmother, about the generations of women who had lived in this house, worked in this kitchen, looked out these windows at the same fields I saw every day. Michelle would be the next in that line, the next woman to make this house a home for the family we hoped to raise here. In August, I made a decision that had been building for months. I legally changed my name from Joshua Clark to Joshua Castillo Clark. I wanted to honor both my family heritage and the name I'd grown up with, to acknowledge both where I came from and where I'd been. The paperwork was simple, but the emotional weight was enormous. For 18 years, I'd been Joshua Clark, the kid with no family and no history. Now I was Joshua Castillo Clark, great-grandson of Eduardo, grandson of Francis, son of Maria, inheritor of a legacy that stretched back generations. That fall, our first full harvest as partners exceeded all expectations. The weather had been perfect, the crops were healthy, and the markets were strong. For the first time since I'd arrived in Cedar Ridge, I felt truly confident about my future as a farmer. More importantly, I felt like I belonged, not just to the land or the community, but to myself. I knew who I was, where I came from, and where I was going. The scared 18-year-old who had stepped off the bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of questions had become a man with roots, with purpose, with a place in the world. In November, I received a call from Carl Torres with news that surprised me. A developer had approached him about purchasing farmland in the area for a housing development. Several of my neighbors had already agreed to sell, and the developer was offering well above market value for my property. "It's enough money to set you up for life," Carl explained. "You could go to any university you wanted, start any kind of business, live anywhere in the world." The offer was tempting in ways I hadn't expected. Financial security beyond anything I'd ever imagined, the freedom to explore opportunities I'd never considered, the chance to see the world beyond the boundaries of Cedar Ridge. But as I walked my fields that evening, thinking about the decision I had to make, I realized there was no real choice involved. This land wasn't just property to me. It was history, legacy, home. It was the place where my great-grandfather had planted his dreams, where my grandmother had preserved those dreams for me, where I was building a future that honored both the past and my own aspirations. I called Carl the next morning and declined the offer. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This kind of money doesn't come along often." "I'm sure," I said. "This land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." Winter that year was mild, giving me time to work on projects I'd been planning since I arrived. I restored my mother's bedroom, turning it into a guest room while preserving the elements that connected it to her memory. I converted the unused nursery into an office where I could manage the business side of farming and continue my education through online courses. Most importantly, I organized all of my grandmother's letters, journals, and photographs into a comprehensive family history. I wanted future generations to understand not just the facts of our family story, but the emotions, the struggles, the love that had shaped every decision. In February, Michelle and I were married in the small church where my mother had been baptized and my grandmother had worshiped for over 40 years. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the community that had become our extended family. Hannah Hughes cried during the vows, George Ward served as my unofficial father figure, and Nicholas Nelson gave a toast about the importance of putting down roots. After the wedding, we honeymooned in Mexico, visiting the region where my great-grandfather had been born. It was my first time outside the United States, my first real understanding of the journey Eduardo had made when he came north looking for opportunity. Standing in the village where my family's story had begun, I felt connected to something larger than myself, part of a narrative that stretched across generations and borders. When we returned to Cedar Ridge, we began the process of making the farmhouse truly ours while respecting its history. We updated the kitchen and bathrooms, But we kept the original hardwood floors and the built-in cabinets that my great-grandfather had crafted by hand. We painted the exterior but maintained the white and green color scheme that had defined the house for decades. In the barn, I created a memorial space for my grandmother and mother. I displayed some of the letters and photographs, along with tools and household items that had belonged to previous generations. It wasn't a shrine exactly, but a place where family history was preserved and honored. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Nicholas and I expanded our operation, leasing additional land from a retiring neighbor and diversifying into organic vegetables for the growing farmers market in the county seat. The work was more complex, but also more rewarding, as we built relationships with customers who appreciated knowing where their food came from. Michelle graduated from nursing school and took a position at the county hospital, but she also became involved in the farm operation, handling bookkeeping and marketing tasks that played to her organizational strengths. We were becoming true partners in every sense of the word, building a life together that honored both our individual talents and our shared commitment to this place. In June, we received news that would change our lives again. Michelle was pregnant. As we sat on the front porch that evening, talking about the future we were creating, I thought about the cycle of generations that had played out in this house. My great-grandfather building dreams, my grandfather expanding them, my grandmother preserving them through loss and hardship, and now Michelle and me preparing to continue the story with a new chapter. "Do you think your grandmother would be happy?" Michelle asked, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "I think she'd be amazed," I said. "I think she'd be proud that her plan worked, that giving me this place led to everything she'd hoped for and more." That summer, as we prepared for the arrival of our first child, I spent evenings writing letters to my unborn son or daughter. Not to hide away like my grandmother had done, but to share openly, to make sure this child would always know they were wanted, loved, and part of something bigger than themselves. "Dear baby," I wrote in one letter, "you are going to be born into a family with deep roots and strong traditions. You will grow up knowing where you come from, who your people are, and what values have sustained us through generations of challenges and changes. But more than that, you will grow up knowing you are loved unconditionally, that you belong completely, and that you have a place in this world that no one can take away from you. You will never have to wonder if someone cares about you, because your parents, your community, and your heritage will surround you with love from the moment you take your first breath." In September, our son was born. We named him Eduardo Francis Castillo Clark, honoring both the great-grandfather who had started our American story and the grandmother who had preserved it for future generations. As I held him for the first time in the same hospital where I had been born 18 years earlier, I felt the completion of a circle that had been broken for far too long. The first time I brought Eduardo home to the farm, I carried him through every room of the house, telling him the stories of the people who had lived there before him. I showed him the fields his ancestors had planted, the barn where family history was preserved, the cemetery where his great-great-grandmother and great-grandmother were buried. "This is your legacy," I whispered to him as we stood on the front porch. "This is where you belong, where you will always belong, no matter where life takes you." That winter, as I watched my son sleep in the crib that had been built for me but never used, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. From the scared 18-year-old aging out of foster care to the confident father preparing to pass on family traditions to the next generation. My grandmother's plan had worked better than she could have imagined. By preserving the farm, by following my life from a distance, by leaving me everything when she died, she had given me not just property but purpose, not just a house but a home, not just land but a legacy. I understood now that love isn't always about being present. Sometimes it's about preparing for a future you won't see, about making sacrifices that won't be understood until years later, about having faith that the people you care about will find their way to where they belong. Frances Castillo had loved me the only way she knew how, and that love had been enough to change everything. As Eduardo grew from infant to toddler, I began to understand my grandmother's perspective in ways I never could have before becoming a parent myself. The fierce protectiveness, the willingness to sacrifice your own happiness for your child's welfare, the way love can make you both brave and terrified at the same time. Watching my son take his first steps on the same floors where my mother had learned to walk, seeing him play in the yard where generations of Castillo children had grown up, I felt connected to a continuity that stretched both backward and forward in time. This house, this land, this life we were building was part of something much larger than any individual story. Michelle proved to be a natural mother, but she was also a full partner in the farming operation. She developed our direct marketing program, building relationships with restaurants and grocery stores that valued locally grown produce. Her nursing background gave her insights into food safety and nutrition that enhanced our organic certification process. By Eduardo's second birthday, we had established ourselves as one of the most successful small farms in the county. We employed several part-time workers during busy seasons, mentored young people interested in sustainable agriculture, and had become advocates for policies that supported family farming. More importantly, we had created the kind of life my grandmother had dreamed of for me, a life rooted in the land, supported by community, and focused on building something lasting for future generations. In the spring of Eduardo's third year, Michelle and I made a decision that felt like the natural next step in our journey. We established the Francis Castillo Memorial Scholarship Fund, using money from my grandmother's college savings account to help other young people from difficult backgrounds pursue agricultural education. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl from the foster care system who had shown interest in sustainable farming. As I presented her with the scholarship check at a ceremony in the high school auditorium, I thought about how my grandmother would have felt knowing that her sacrifice was continuing to create opportunities for young people who needed a second chance. That summer, we welcomed our second child, a daughter we named Maria Frances Castillo Clark. Like her brother, she would grow up knowing exactly where she came from, who her people were, and how much she was loved. As I held Maria for the first time, I made her the same promises I had made to Eduardo, that she would always belong, always be wanted, always have a place in this world that no one could take away from her, that she would grow up surrounded by the love her great-great-grandmother had been unable to show me directly, but had preserved and passed down through careful planning and quiet sacrifice. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary miracles of family life. First days of school, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer evenings on the front porch. The kinds of moments my grandmother had missed with me, but that she had made possible for my children through her decision to preserve our family's legacy. Eduardo and Maria grew up knowing the stories of their ancestors, understanding the history of the land they played on, learning the values that had sustained our family through generations of challenges and changes. They knew they were part of something bigger than themselves, connected to a heritage that gave their lives meaning and purpose. When Eduardo was 8 and Maria was 5, I took them to visit their great-grandmother's grave for the first time. We brought flowers, as Michelle and I had done every year since our marriage, and I told them about the woman who had loved them before they were born, who had made their lives possible through her sacrifice and foresight. "Why didn't she ever meet you when you were little?" Eduardo asked with the directness that only children possess. "Because sometimes the people who love us have to make hard choices," I explained. "Sometimes they have to do things that hurt them because they believe it's better for us. Great-grandmother Frances gave me up because she thought other people could take better care of me than she could. But she never stopped loving me, and she never stopped planning for the day when I would come home." "But she was wrong, wasn't she?" Maria said. "She could have taken care of you." "Maybe," I said, "but if she had kept me, I might never have learned to appreciate what we have here. I might have taken it for granted instead of understanding how precious it is to have a place where you belong." As the children grew older, they became more involved in the farm operation. Eduardo showed a natural aptitude for machinery and crop management, while Maria was drawn to the business and marketing aspects. Both understood that they were being prepared to continue a legacy that had been passed down through generations. But I also made sure they understood that their inheritance came with choice. Unlike me, they would grow up knowing they belonged somewhere, knowing they had options, knowing they were loved unconditionally. If they chose to leave the farm, to pursue other dreams, to build different kinds of lives, they would do so with my blessing and support. The gift my grandmother had given me wasn't just the farm, it was the knowledge that I belonged somewhere, that I was part of something lasting, that my life had meaning and purpose. Whether my children chose to continue farming or not, they would carry that gift with them wherever they went. By the time Eduardo turned 15 and Maria was 12, our farm had become a model for sustainable agriculture in the region. We hosted tours for agricultural students, provided internships for young farmers, and had been featured in several publications as an example of how family farms could thrive in the modern economy. More importantly, we had created the kind of community my grandmother had always envisioned. Our farm was a gathering place for neighbors, a source of healthy food for local families, and a training ground for the next generation of farmers. We had honored her legacy not just by preserving the land, but by making it a force for good in the broader community. The scholarship fund had grown to support multiple students each year, and we had established partnerships with agricultural programs at universities across the Midwest. Young people who had aged out of foster care, who had overcome difficult circumstances, who needed a second chance were finding opportunities through the foundation my grandmother's sacrifice had made possible. Michelle had become a leader in the State Nursing Association while maintaining her role on the farm. She had proven that it was possible to honor traditional values while embracing modern opportunities, to respect the past while building for the future. As for me, I had found the peace that had eluded me for the first 18 years of my life. I knew who I was, where I belonged, and what my purpose was. I had built the life my grandmother had dreamed of for me, not through her direct guidance, but through the foundation she had laid and the opportunities she had preserved. On quiet evenings when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, Michelle and I would sit on the front porch and talk about our plans for the future, expansion possibilities, educational opportunities for the children, ways to ensure the farm's sustainability for future generations. But we also talked about the past, about the people who had made our lives possible, about the sacrifices and choices that had led to this moment. We understood that we were living the dreams of people we had never met, honoring the hopes of ancestors who had worked and saved and planned for a future they wouldn't see. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have been like if my grandmother had made different choices, if she had fought harder to keep me, if she had reached out during my childhood, if she had been brave enough to contact me before she died. But I had learned that wondering about alternative histories was less important than making the most of the reality I had been given. The truth was that my grandmother's choices, painful as they were, had led to exactly the life I was meant to live. Her sacrifice had given me the motivation to succeed in school, the appreciation for family that I might not have had if I'd grown up taking it for granted, and the determination to build something lasting for my own children. In the end, Frances Castillo had been a better grandmother than either of us had realized. She had given me not just property, but purpose. Not just a house, but a home. Not just land, but a legacy. She had loved me the only way she knew how, and that love had been enough to change everything. As I write this, Eduardo is preparing to graduate from high school with plans to study agricultural engineering at the State University. Maria is already showing leadership skills that suggest she might be interested in agricultural policy or rural development. Both understand that they are inheritors of a legacy that stretches back generations and forward into a future they will help create. They know the story of their great-great-grandmother, Frances, the woman who loved from a distance, who preserved their inheritance through decades of loneliness and regret, who made their lives possible through her sacrifice and foresight. They understand that they are living proof that love can transcend time, distance, and even death. Today, as I watch my children play in the yard where their ancestors played, as I work the fields that have sustained our family for generations, as I sit on the porch where my grandmother spent countless evenings thinking about the grandson she had given up, I am filled with gratitude for the complicated, imperfect, ultimately beautiful way that love works in this world. My grandmother, Frances Castillo, never got to hold me as a child, never got to celebrate my birthdays, never got to see me graduate or get married or become a father. But her love shaped every aspect of my life nonetheless. Her sacrifice made my success possible. Her planning created my opportunities, and her faith in my potential gave me the foundation I needed to build a meaningful life. The barn where I found those crates full of hidden love has become a symbol of everything I've learned about family, belonging, and the ways that love can survive even when it seems lost. The letters my grandmother wrote but never sent taught me that love doesn't always need to be expressed to be real. The presents she wrapped but never gave showed me that caring doesn't require recognition to be meaningful. Most importantly, the farm she preserved for me demonstrated that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is not our presence, but our preparation for their future. I've learned that family isn't always about who raises you or who's there for your daily life. Sometimes family is about who believes in your potential when you can't see it yourself, who makes sacrifices you'll never fully understand, who loves you enough to let you go so you can find your way back on your own terms. My children will grow up with advantages I never had. They'll know from birth that they are wanted, loved, and part of something bigger than themselves. They'll have the security of belonging, the confidence of knowing their history, and the freedom that comes from understanding they have choices. But they'll also understand that these advantages came at a cost, that their comfortable lives were built on the sacrifices of previous generations, that their opportunities exist because someone else was willing to give up their own happiness to create a better future. As they grow older and face their own challenges and decisions, I hope they'll remember the story of their great-great-grandmother, Frances, the woman who loved them before they were born, who made their lives possible through her quiet strength and enduring faith. I hope they'll understand that love isn't always easy or obvious, that family isn't always about biology or proximity, that belonging is something you can carry with you wherever you go if you understand where you came from and who you are. Most of all, I hope they'll know that they are part of a story that began long before they were born and will continue long after they're gone, that their lives have meaning and purpose that extends beyond their individual achievements and happiness. If you're listening to this story and you've ever felt alone, ever wondered if anyone cares about you, ever questioned whether you belong anywhere, I want you to know that you're not as alone as you think. Sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones we can't see, the ones who love us from a distance, the ones who make sacrifices we'll never fully understand. Your story isn't over yet. Your family might not look like what you expected. Your home might not be where you thought it would be. Your belonging might come in ways you never imagined. But if you're open to the possibilities, if you're willing to look beyond the obvious answers, if you have the courage to accept love in whatever form it comes, you might discover that you've been cared for all along. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw your life. Have you ever found love in unexpected places or learned that someone cared about you in ways you never knew? Your story matters, and I'd love to hear how this one resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about family, belonging, and the unexpected ways that love shapes our lives. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they're not as alone as they think they are. Remember, home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you end up when you finally understand who you're meant to be.